Hello and welcome. This is John Ford back with you, presenting on behalf of CyberHawks for the Cyber Challenge competition. In this tutorial, we'll be going over how to use the Metasploit exploitation framework provided in Kali Linux to do some scanning as well as exploitation, and then we'll be briefly going over past the hash attacks. Now, before we get started, I want to hammer in the concepts of bind shell and reverse shell to make sure you completely understand them. I am coming into this with the assumption that you already have knowledge on basic networking concepts, such as internet protocol addresses, ports, how routers versus computers, or switches, I suppose. Those sorts of things. If you do not have that kind of knowledge or would like to brush up on that knowledge, let me know. I will send you a link to my first seminar on hacking where I did talk about that sort of thing very briefly at the beginning. If you are watching this on YouTube, the link to that is also in the description, so you can find it there. But assuming you understand that, let's first discuss what a bind shell is. So, as an attacker, your objective is to, well, get a shell running on the target computer. What that means is you have terminal access to the target computer. Now, no matter how you go about doing that, you're somehow going to have to get malicious code to execute on the target computer to establish a connection. Now, there are two types of connections that you can establish. One is called a bind shell, the other is called a reverse shell. If, in case you're not familiar with it, in any sort of networking, there is going to be one machine that acts as the server and another machine that acts as the client. Now, the only difference between the server and the client is that the server opens itself up for incoming connections on a specific port, and the client machine connects to that server on that specific port. A server, when it opens itself for incoming connections, is in what's known as the listening state. In a bind shell, one of the two shells that we as attackers have to choose from, the server is the target. So in other words, the target opens itself up for incoming connections, and then we as the attacker connect to it. This is what we'll be using predominantly for the Cyber Challenge competition because we are doing everything through a VPN. And because of the way the VPN is set up, your computer should have access or be able to connect to the target, but the target isn't able to connect back to you. And because the target can't connect back to you, it has to act as the server for all shell connections. The second type of shell that we have is a reverse shell. In a reverse shell, it's sort of the opposite of a bind shell. So instead of the target acting as the server, the attacker acts as the server. The attacker listens for incoming connections, and then the target connects back to the attacker. This is one of the more commonly used types of shells because imagine that the target has a firewall that blocks incoming connections from the attacker. Well, this sort of shell allows you to get past that firewall because instead of you as the attacker going in and connecting to the target connects back to you. You might notice that my terminal window looks a little different than in the past. That's because I just updated to the most recent version of Kali. Hooray! Now this tutorial will be targeted more towards red teamers or attackers as opposed to blue teamers or defenders. Because we'll actually be looking at how to use a framework that's intended to attack a computer or a machine, I should say. However, it's nice for blue team to see the sorts of things we're doing. Maybe red team is something you'll be interested in the future. And in any case, it's good to know what sorts of tools attackers have at their disposal. So let's get right into it. First of all, to start up the Metasploit framework, you can start it up with msf console. If you type in that command and hit enter, it should start the Metasploit framework. However, I am not going to do that just yet because I'd like to do one more thing. In Metasploit, the framework comes with a database. Now, the purpose of the database is to make your attacks savable and easy to read and search through. What I mean by that is, if you're scanning a bunch of different machines on the network, and they each have different services running on them on different ports, they have different operating systems. Within Metasploit, you can use the Metasploit database to more quickly search for a specific machine, or I should say a specific operating system or a specific service. I will show you all the commands for doing that. However, in order to be able to do that, you have to start up the Metasploit Framework database. And the way you do that is with sudo msfdb, or Metasploit database, init for initialize. Execute that. Of course, you'll have to type in your password for sudo. And I actually already started it, so the database is already started. And then I can go ahead and go msf console. Now this takes a while to start up, so I actually already have it running in a separate window. But once you type in msf console and press enter, you should get a window that looks like this. Now the Metasploit framework is intended to be very easy to use. And part of that means it comes with very nice help screens. Now, to list all the commands that are available to you in the Metasploit framework, you can use the help command. This help lists all the possible commands in the Metasploit framework. I'm not going to go through each of these, but I'll go through some of the most important ones. Also note that we have a separate shell known as the Metasploit shell, and this shell allows us to execute these special commands. We started that shell with the msf console command. Now also note that I can execute regular Linux commands from within the Metasploit shell. For example, to get my IP address, I can still use the IPA command even if I am within the Metasploit shell. Now, in addition to the help command, which lists all the available commands and a brief description of what each of them does, I can additionally use the -h flag or type in -h after every command to show more info about that specific command. For example, if I wanted to gain more info about the services command, I could type in services -h, and now I get a nice help screen describing the usage information for the services command, providing me with all the flags as well as a description of what each of the flags does. Next, I'd like to go over some of the scanning related things that you can do in Metasploit, as well as how to use the database to better manage the results of your scans. To ensure that you have started the database correctly, as in that you have actually done msfdb in it, as I described earlier, you can check the status of your database with db_status. In fact, all of the database commands are prefixed with db_. You'll notice that since it says PostgreSQL for connection type, our database is connected successfully. In the real world, when you might be conducting multiple pen tests on multiple networks, and it would be nice to have each of these pen tests in a separate space, or I should say the results of each pen test in a separate space. For this purpose, msf console has the workspace command. So if I type in workspace, I can see all of the workspaces that are available to me. Note that if you're typing this in for the first time, you should only have the default workspace. But because I was playing around with this before, I also have the test workspace. To remove a workspace, I can do workspace-d for delete and the name of the workspace. If I delete the test workspace, then I will be automatically switched to the default workspace. Now if I list the workspaces with the workspace command, you'll notice that only the default workspace is left. Also notice that the workspace that has red text as well as an asterisk preceding it is the workspace I'm currently in. I'll create an example workspace for the scans that I'm about to demonstrate. If you'd like to switch workspaces, you can switch between workspaces with the name of the workspace. For example, if I want to switch back to my default workspace, I can just type in workspace and then default. Now I've switched back to default workspace. However, I like to work in my example workspace. Now, if you've already conducted some scans with Nmap, which is probably the most popular scanning tool, you can import those scans with db_import. For example, I have already conducted an Nmap scan, and I have saved the results of that scan in my working directory, which is /home/Kali. So if I do db_import, and then the name of the scan, which is scan.xml, this will import all my Nmap data from that scan. Note that the scan I conducted was a simple Nmap-A scan on the entire target network, or I should say the cyber competition network, which I am currently connected to. Also, keep in mind that if you're not familiar with Nmap, the scanning tool, but would like to be more familiar with Nmap, the scanning tool, as an attacker, I highly recommend it. If you are watching this on YouTube, there is a link in the description to a video that I go over in my pen testing series, where I talk about scanning in depth and I cover Metasploit. I'm also going to show the link here. And if you are not watching this on YouTube and you don't feel like retyping the link, feel free to reach out to me and I can send that link to you as well. Anyway, assuming you have some understanding of Nmap, I'd like to point out that in addition to importing Nmap scans, you can also export your current database if you've conducted more scans with db_export. Choose the format XML, and then choose the name of what you want to export it as. So I just exported our current database under export.xml. I can execute Nmap commands from within Metasploit. If I don't want the Nmap commands to be added to the database, I can just simply execute an Nmap command with the regular Nmap as I would normally. For example, I'm going to scan a network on which I am running Metasploitable 2. You'll notice that this gave me the results of a regular Nmap ping scan because I conducted an Nmap ping scan. However, if I would like to add the results of my Nmap scan to the Metasploit database directly, I can instead execute db_nmap. This version of Nmap provides all the same options as the default Nmap. However, it will add your results to the Metasploit database. Now I know that 10.0.2.5 is my vulnerable Metasploitable machine. The reason I know that is because I looked it up in advance. I just performed a simple if config on my Metasploitable machine. But for demonstration purposes, I'm going to be performing scans and also attempting to exploit that machine. And I conducted a simple Nmap-A scan. Note that for those of you who aren't as familiar with Nmap-A, runs the basic scripts across it and also attempts to perform some OS detection, as well as some other things. It's kind of -A for all, so it does all of the basic things you would do in a scan. Now, what can we do with this information that we've just gathered? Note that I have both the information from my current, in the database, I have both the information from my current scan that I just conducted on the vulnerable Metasploitable 2 machine, and the information from my previous import in which I scanned the Cyber Challenge competition environment. First of all, I can list the hosts or the IPs of the machines that I discovered as a result of my scan using the hosts command. Of course, note that with hosts-h, I can list all the options that the host command provides me with. If I just do hosts, without any flags, it will list the machines I have. You'll notice I have the vulnerable Metasploitable machine, as well as the Windows 2012 server that is part of the competition environment. In addition, the nice thing about the hosts command is that I can automatically set our hosts using the host command. What that means is whenever we use Metasploit modules, which I'll talk about later in this video, we'll have to set the remote host, or our target, in other words. I can really quickly set the target with this command simply by appending -r. And then any of the hosts that end up being listed as a result of the command will additionally be set as a target for our proceeding scans as well as attacks. So, for example, a couple other things I can do is I can list, you'll notice I have all of these columns to choose from. Let's say I just wanted to see the IP addresses of the machines as well as the OS operating system name of the machine. I can choose which columns I'd like to list with -c. For example, if I list address and OS name, then this will only list the IP addresses and operating systems associated with the hosts. To search and limit my results by my search, I can use the -s flag. For example, if I know that I would like to target all the Linux machines on my network, I can do -s followed by Linux. This, you'll notice, will list only one machine because only one of the two machines that I scanned was a Linux machine. If I'd like to set this as my target now, I can do -r, as I discussed earlier, and you'll notice that this will set our hosts, or in other words, my target, to that machine. This is extraordinarily helpful for if you have, let's say, 10 Linux machines on the network, but you want to try and attack against all of them. You can simply execute this command with -r appended to the end, and they'll be automatically set as, all of them will be automatically set as the target for the exploits that you will conduct. In addition to listing by hosts, I can also list the services that were found running as a result of my scan. You'll notice that part of the services were for the Metasploitable machine, and then the other part were for the vulnerable Windows machine in the competition environment. Similarly to with hosts, I can do services-h to get a beautiful help screen that will list all my options for me. I can do services-c to list only specific columns. For example, if I want information about the service as well as the name of the service, I can use -c and list only the info and name columns. I can use -p to list all of the services within a specific port or port range, and I can also search with -s, just like I could for hosts. For example, if I search for HTTP, or in other words, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, that would be the protocol used to host websites, and I search for that between ports 70 and 81 and list the info and name columns, you'll notice that here I have my Metasploitable 2 machine with info regarding the version of HTTP that it is running, as well as the name of the protocol, which is HTTP. Similarly to with hosts, I was able to set, remember, my targets using -r. I can do a similar sort of thing with services. If I add the -r flag at the end, it will set everything that services would normally list to be my target. In this case, I will not do this. In addition to these two commands, two more that I will not be going as in depth in are creds. Now, a lot of the times while you're conducting a pen test, you'll come across credentials. Sometimes you'll even come across them in your scans. Any credentials that you come across in your scans will be listed under here when you type in creds. Now, in addition to credentials, let's say you have already broken into a machine or completed an exploit and you dumped the hashes on the machine. What that means is, perhaps I'll explain hashes at this point in the tutorial. Hashes are encrypted versions of passwords stored on your local machine. So the way logging in works is when you choose to log in, for example, as a user or as an administrator, the password that you enter is first converted into a hash. Then it's checked with one that's currently stored locally on the machine. And if the hashes match, then you are allowed to log into the machine. If the hashes do not match, then you entered an incorrect password. The reason that computers store passwords in the form of hashes rather than in the form of plain text or the password itself is because so that any attacker who breaks into the computer doesn't have access to the original password, but instead can only see the hashes of the passwords that are on the computer. Of course, I should mention that hashes are any sort of are when some sort of operation is performed to obscure original text. The purpose of a hash is so that every password only has one unique corresponding hash, ideally, so that no two passwords result in the same hash. And therefore, if a password is converted to a hash, it is unique and can be checked against another hash stored in the computer to determine whether the user entered the correct password. Now, if as a result of performing a hash dump you have found hashes on a remote machine, you can view those using the loot command. Loot will list any of the hashes that you have found on machines that you have been scanning. Now, that's how to scan, I suppose, in the Metasploit framework. There are also modules for scanning, which we will talk about in a moment. However, first I'd like to explain the whole concept of what the Metasploit framework does. Well, the Metasploit framework is a collection of scripts that are community-based, and those scripts allow for performing auxiliary information gathering or exploitation or post-exploitation more easily without having to write the code for it yourself. Now, those scripts, each script is known as a module. The show command in Metasploit will show you all the available modules at your disposal. You can show them all with show all. However, this command takes a long time to execute, and therefore I will not demonstrate it at the moment. If I do show-h, I can see all the valid options for the show command. For example, if I wanted to just see, in addition to, of course, I should mention, in addition to exploits, auxiliary, and post, you can also see a lot of modules for other things, such as, or I should say, there are a lot of other things you can see besides exploitation modules, such as you can choose from different payloads. Remember, if you remember from the MSF Venom malware generation tutorial, we talked about payloads. Well, the same payloads that are available with MSF Venom are also available here, and you can see them with show payloads. And similarly to what we talked about in that tutorial as well, you could also see the encoders, but the important ones are exploits, payloads, of course, auxiliary, post. Those are kind of the main ones that you'll be using. Now, you can search any one of these using the search command. Of course, the search command also has its own help screen that explains to you all the options that you can use when searching. Most simply, if you type in search and then search for a string, or that can be any string that you want, just type it in, then it'll show all the results for that string. Of course, I have to actually type it in correctly. Now, from my scan, for example, if I look at what services I find on port 22, or sorry, not port 22, port 21, FTP, you'll notice that my Metasploitable machine has an FTP server running on port 21, and the version for that is VSF TPD 2.3.4. So knowing this, I can search my Metasploit database with the search command to see if there are any known vulnerabilities for VSF TPD, and especially this version. Now, also note that there is an online website that you can visit where you can also search these modules, and some people prefer to go on the website rather than using the search command. Because I can use the search command, you'll notice that when I searched VSF TPD, I found a backdoor that I can use to gain remote code execution on the Metasploitable machine. I can also search for specific types of modules. For example, if I know that I'm looking specifically for exploits rather than scanning, note that any sort of scan is called auxiliary. So whenever you see auxiliary, that's another term for a scan. But in this case, we want an exploit. I can do type : exploit, then what I'm searching for, and it'll search for that. Note that I can also just search for VSF TPD in the name, because right now it searches for it both in the name and in the description. However, if I just want to search for it in the name, I could type in name : VSF TPD. That would simply search for it in the name. Of course, we have the same results either way in this case. Now, to use one of these modules, I use the command use. So use, then I can type the name of the module. In this case, the name of the module is this: exploit/unix/ftp/vsftpd_ I should say 234 backdoor. Note that tab autocomplete works in the Metasploit Framework terminal as well, or MSF console, I should say, as well. Now, if I type that and press enter, you'll notice that if it loads correctly, you'll see this little banner telling me that I am currently using this module. If I, in fact, do not want to use this module, I can always go back with the back command. But of course, in this case, I do want to use it. Now, when using any module, you have a number of configurable options available to you. To show these options, or I should say to show the main options, I can use the command show options. You'll notice that the things I can configure are R hosts, which if you remember earlier, because I used the -R flag, it has already been set to my Metasploitable machine. R port, which is 21, which is the port for FTP, as well as the payload. In this case, there's only one payload, so there's not much to set there. And the exploit target, which in this case, it's automatic, so there's nothing to set there as well. If you'd like to see more advanced options at any point, you can do show advanced. This shows a much wider variety of options. However, most of these are irrelevant for your exploitation purposes, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. I should say, as we discussed in the tutorial when we were talking about how to generate malware, each exploit requires a payload. A payload is the specific shellcode, malicious shellcode, that is executed on the target that allows you to gain connection to the target. So in this case, to show the payloads that are compatible with this module, I'll do show payloads. You'll notice that only one is compatible with this module. If I wanted to set the payload manually, right now, of course, it is by default set to the only one that we can use, but to set it manually, I use the set command and say payload, and then I type the name of the payload. You'll notice that the name of the payload is displayed right here. At this point, I should talk about the two different kinds of shells that are available to you in the Metasploit framework. The first is the basic command shell. So in this case, you'll notice that because our payload started with CMD, we're using a basic command shell. Now this means we will be able to run basic Unix commands on the target machine. Unix commands are commands like the ones I am currently running, ls, cd, pwd, the ones that are more fully discussed in my tutorial on the basic commands in Linux and Windows. Now, for Windows machines, obviously, it wouldn't say Unix there, it would say Windows. The Meterpreter shell, which is the second kind of shell we have, is a more advanced shell that comes with the Metasploit framework. It gives you it makes a lot of things that would be difficult to do with a regular command line much easier. So for example, logging keystrokes can be done with one simple command to start logging and stop logging keystrokes. What that means is to record every key that the user presses. To take screenshots, there's a screenshot command. It just makes a lot of things easier. And of course, at any point, if we're in a Meterpreter shell and we want to get a regular command shell, we can do that by typing in shell. I will also show you that later. But in any case, the point I'm trying to make is we have two kinds of shells. We have your regular command shell and we have Meterpreter shells. However, for this exploit, it only supports the regular command shell. I can perform a set command on any one of these options. For example, if I want to set the R hosts or our target to something else, I can do set R hosts and then whatever I'd like to set it to. In this case, I want to keep it the same, so I will not execute this. Now, I will quickly discuss why it's called R hosts and R port. The R stands for remote. Remember that in a connection, in a bind shell connection, you, as the attacker, are connecting to the remote computer, which is your target, that's acting as the server. So you'll always need to specify R host and R port. Of course, because it's plural, R hosts, that means you can have multiple targets that you're connecting to. Now, in the case of reverse shells, which you will not be using for this competition, but it's good to know because they're much more common in general than bind shells, you might also see L host and L port. That stands for local host and local port. Because in a reverse shell, the target has to connect back to your computer, in the malicious code that you deliver to them, you also have to specify your computer's IP address to connect to, as well as a port to connect back to on your computer. So for reverse shells, you will additionally see L hosts and L port. If this confused you, the biggest takeaway here is that anytime you see R host, that is your target IP. Anytime you see R port, that is your target port. However, anytime you see L hosts, that's your computers, so your attacking IP. And anytime you see L port, that's any port you'd like to choose to connect back to on your computer, which if you're using Kali Linux can be any port of your choice that isn't already in use. A very common one is 4444. I think that's what it's set to by default anyway. To check if an exploit is applicable to a specific target, you can use the check command. Of course, some modules, such as this one, are too basic to support check, so you'll simply have to perform the exploit itself. To perform the exploit, you can either type in run or you can type in exploit. They both do the same thing. You'll notice that now that I've performed this exploit, I have a command shell open on the target, and I can execute commands, such as who am I? And you'll notice that I have root privileges on this machine. To background any one of my sessions, for example, if I'd like to keep this open in the background, but also break into another machine, I can do Control Z. It'll ask me if I'd like to background the session, and I'll say Y. From there, I can list my running sessions with sessions-L for list. You'll notice that I have this one running from a while back, which I'll be connecting to later in this tutorial, and the one that we just currently created, which is a Unix shell. And it's running as an active session with ID 12. The sessions command in general is what allows you to deal with your various sessions. Now, by session, I mean each shell that you have connected to one specific target. So I have one shell connected to the Windows that is on the Cyber Challenge environment, and I will not tell you how I connected because that will be part of what you have to do during the competition. And I have another shell connected to the Metasploitable machine that I just connected to. Of course, I can see all the options I have for working with sessions by doing sessions-H, just as with every other command. To reconnect to a specific session, let's say I'm done doing other things and I want to go back and start interacting with my Metasploitable machine again, I can do sessions-I for interact and then the ID, which in this case is 12. And now I'm once again able to run commands on the Metasploitable machine. If I'm completely finished with a session, I can type in exit to exit the session completely. However, I will not do that just yet. As an alternative, and sometimes exit doesn't work, you can always do Control C. That will also terminate your session. Now, you'll notice that I am not running a Meterpreter session here. I am running a regular Unix command shell. But let's say I wanted to run the better Meterpreter shell, which makes performing certain operations much easier on my end. Well, in order to do that, I can do sessions-U for upgrade or upgrade shell, and then the ID of the session that I would like to upgrade. Unfortunately, this will not work on the Metasploitable 2 machine because the Metasploitable 2 machine is a very simple machine and it cannot accurately process commands as complex as are required for the Meterpreter shell to run. In order to kill all the sessions that I currently have open, I can do sessions-K. Capital K kills all the sessions. If I want to kill a specific session, killing is the same as going into it and typing in exit or typing in Control C, but you don't actually have to enter it. If I want to kill a specific section, I can do -lowercase k and then the session ID, in this case 12. You'll notice that that just closed my connection with the Metasploitable machine, Now, if I list my sessions again, you won't see it anymore. To demonstrate the rest of the things I can do with the Metasploit framework, I will connect to my session on the Windows machine that is part of the Cyber Challenge environment. You'll notice that on this one, I have a Meterpreter shell. If I type in help, I can see all of the additional commands that I can do with this Meterpreter shell. One such command is #dump. What this command does is it allows you to dump, or in other words, print out all of the password hashes that are stored on that computer. Now, this might come in useful for a pass the hash attack. A pass the hash attack is when somebody uses the same password across multiple devices. So for example, if a system administrator is administering multiple machines, but they happen to use the same password on 2 different machines, if you break into one of them, you can take the hash from that computer or from that machine and use it to break into another machine, or to gain access to, I should say, another machine. So that's where #dumps come in handy. If I type in #dump, this will perform a #dump on the Windows machine. The odd thing is, I'm not sure why, but for this Windows machine, the #dump command doesn't work. However, there's actually another way of, after I did some digging, there's another way of dumping hashes, and that's by using a different Meterpreter module, or I should say Metasploit module. So if I background this session with Control-Z, I'll check for, or I'll search for a post-exploitation module that will allow me to perform a #dump. This is using the search command, which I described earlier. You'll notice that there are plenty, and one that we can use is post windows gather #dump. Now, in order to use this, I'll use it just like I use any other module. Post-exploitation modules are slightly different in that when I look at their options, they require a specific session ID. Now, the session ID specifies which session this module is going to be run on. For example, I want to run this post-exploitation module on the Windows machine, which has session ID 9. Once again, if you look at sessions-L, you'll notice that the ID is 9. So I'll set, in this case, the session to 9. And then, or sorry, it's session singular, not plural. There we go. And then I'll type in exploit to exploit, or run. They both do the same thing. Now, I already did this earlier, and it takes a really long time, so I'm not going to sit here and wait for it to finish. I'm just going to Control-C to terminate. But in the end, you will obtain the hashes that are on the Windows machine. Now, from there, let's use a pass the hash attack to gain access to another machine which uses the same password. In this case, I'll simply be demonstrating how to gain access once again to the same Windows machine because we don't have another machine using the same password. But in a real world environment, you would be attempting this password, using this password with the same username on a different machine to hopefully gain access to that machine. First of all, I'll kill all the sessions that I currently have because they're no longer necessary. Now, within Metasploit, you can do this using the ps exec module. Note that in Windows, there is a process called server message block. What server message block does is it allows multiple computers to communicate between each other, or for Windows to communicate between other things like a printer or devices like that. Now, we can use any sort of login that is applicable to a Windows computer. We can use on SMB to gain access to the Windows computer. If I show my options, you'll notice that I have quite a few more, but most of them aren't necessary. I should also mention that when you're looking at your options, there's a required tab, which tells you whether or not the option is necessary for you to set. If you see no, you don't have to set that option. Now, I already attempted this exploit before, which is why these options are filled in for me. But if I were doing this for the first time, I'd set the payload to what I want the payload to be. In this case, because we're going through a VPN and the target machine cannot connect back to us, we will be using a bind TCP shell as opposed to a reverse TCP shell. And we will be using Meterpreter, in my opinion, superior command shell. Also, it's important to note this additional option, exit func. A lot of the times, commands that you would use to, or I should say, exploits that you would use on a target machine would result in the machine crashing if your exploit fails. Or not always the machine crashing, but a lot of the times the service that the exploit applies to will crash. Or sometimes if you establish a connection and have a shell, then as soon as you exit it, the service will crash, which will look very strange it would be much easier to pick up by a blue teamer. Now, by default, exit func or exit function is set to process. That means that if you terminate your shell connection, you will terminate the entire process associated with it. However, by setting exit func to thread, this causes only the thread to terminate when you disconnect from the service, and therefore the service will continue to run. Only the current thread that you were connected to it on will be terminated. Now, I highly recommend, as a general rule, every time you're performing an exploit within the Metasploit framework, always set exit func to thread, because this will allow you to perform the exploit again in case you fail the first time. And also when you disconnect from the machine, it will look less suspicious for a blue teamer or for a defender. The other options I have to set are I already set the payload, are the remote host, which is 10.0.2.5. The username, which is SMB user. In this case, I'm logging in as blue team. And the password, SMB pass. Now here's where I'll put the hash that I found earlier. And you'll just have to take my word for it because I didn't actually show it to you in this video, but when I performed the earlier hash dump, I found that the corresponding password, or the corresponding password hash for the blue team user was this. Note that sometimes hashes will be a little bit longer than this, or they'll have extra colons, or they'll have something before this. But the important part of the hash is this first long number, the colon, and then the second long number. Now, if I type in exploit and exploit, I should be able to log in as the blue team user using this password hash. I'm not actually going to demonstrate this here because I would like to demonstrate a second way, not using the Metasploit framework, to perform a pass the hash attack. Another way I can perform a pass the hash attack is using the built-in Kali Linux pass the hash tools. To list all the tools, they all start with pass the hash, or PTH. If I type in PTH dash and then I press tab, it will show all the options I have for performing pass the hash attacks. You'll notice you can see the result of my previously attempting this attack. So we, in this case, because we're targeting a Windows machine through SMB, we will use pth-winexe to perform our pass the hash attack. Then, to gain more information about how to use this command, you can of course view the help screen with -h. Now, to actually perform the pass the hash attack, we'll use the -u flag, which allows us to specify a username as well as a password. Our username is blue team, and our hash is the one that we found earlier. Then I'll put 2 slashes and the host, which in this case, the IP of the machine that we're attacking is 172.16.144.105. And then after that, I'll type in the command I would like to execute. Note that I can execute any command of my choosing. You'll notice that I just passed in this hash as the password for user blue team. And by logging into blue team, I was able to execute the command, who am I? And I got in response that I am blue team user. If I wanted to get a complete command shell, which is usually the goal of any attacker, I can simply execute the command cmd, which spawns a command shell. I now have full access to the Windows computer. Oops. Apparently the backspace doesn't work, it's a little weird, but I can execute all the same commands that I would normally execute on a Windows computer. Also, I forgot to demonstrate this earlier, but in the Metasploit framework, if I have a Meterpreter shell, I can type in the shell command, press enter, and that will give me a shell very similar to the one I used, to the one I would get if I were to connect to the target with a normal shell. So if you're ever in a Meterpreter shell and you want to use the regular Windows commands on the target computer, you can type in shell, press enter, and execute regular Windows commands. Now this concludes this tutorial for how to use the Metasploit framework, a somewhat in-depth look into everything it has to offer, how to scan and save your scan results to the Metasploit framework database to make choosing hosts or services to target much easier, how to use Metasploit modules, as well as how to do some post-exploitation procedures. I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial and that it was informative. I know I covered a lot. If you have questions or if you need to rewatch any part of this, I completely understand. Feel free to reach out to me at jford11@hawk.iit.edu. I will be happy to answer your questions. I can also answer your questions if you're attending this meeting right now, the Cyber Challenge competition meeting. I'll be happy to answer your questions. And that's it. Good luck, everyone.